Thank you for joining us today as we begin a conversation about the history of the Asian American community in Philadelphia. While the PBS series Asian Americans was important in many ways as the first major public television initiative to attempt a comprehensive overview of Asian American history, there's no way to fully cover the breadth and scope of a community this diverse in only 5 hours. The Asian American and Pacific Islander community encompasses more than 40 distinct cultures and countries of origin, with individuals ranging from first-generation immigrants to mixed-race fourth-generation Americans like myself. That's why we're having a conversation like this today, to provide some additional context on the Asian American experience here on the East Coast, and specifically Philadelphia. The PBS Asian American series focuses mainly on the West Coast narrative, which is significant because of their substantial Asian American population demographics. However, there are many similarities to the immigration experience regardless of where you come from. The circumstances that brought Asian Americans to Philadelphia and the local environment that we have now become a part of differ greatly from the West Coast. Some families, like my own, found themselves to be the only persons of their ethnicity living in rural suburban communities, isolated from their ancestral cultures. Others were able to maintain closer ties to their heritage, living in ethnic enclave communities like Philadelphia, Chinatown, and other East Coast cities. Our stories, our challenges, dreams, and ambitions are unique and ever evolving. It is impossible to define an essential Asian American experience in the same way that we cannot define the American experience as a whole under a single narrative. This conversation is the first in a series that will take place over the course of winter and spring 2021, as we delve deeper into the local experiences of Philadelphia's Asian American community. We are grateful to WHYY for providing this platform to educate our own community and the public at large. Before we get into our conversation, I believe we have a short teaser for the Asian American series. Can we roll the clip?
I'm here today, so the rest of this world hears our story. For 4.5 years, my family was incarcerated. The government framed it as an issue of loyalty.
Many people lose everything.
Asian voices were so inspirational.
They had to assert their rights.
The railroad could not have been built without the Chinese.
We fought on the side of the United States.
There was a shift in political power.
Asian Americans were free to do anything they wanted.
All hell broke loose. The city burned.
They were trying to build a life for themselves.
I grew up with the American dream.
You've got young people fighting to make change happen. If a lot of people put their mind to it, they can win.
It was an incredible time.
And their legacy belongs to all of us.
This is our story.
Well, hopefully most of you joining us tonight have already seen the PBS series, but if not, hopefully you have a better sense of the program content from that clip that we just saw. Like the PBS series itself, there's no way that we can cover the full extent of Philadelphia's Asian American history in a single conversation, but we hope that tonight's conversation will provide a good starting point as we delve into these topics with greater nuance next year. I'd like to start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves. Faria, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you, Rob. My name is Faria Khan. I'm the Associate Director of Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I also had the honor of serving for 4 years under Governor Wolf's Advisory Commission for Asian Pacific American Affairs, where I had the opportunity to learn from many of our Asian American communities throughout the state. I'm a proud Pakistani American Muslim, and I'm delighted to join you all today. Thanks.
Thank you, Faria. Katsi, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks, Rob. My name is Katsi Vilayfan, and I am an artist. And I also run an organization called Laos in the House, which promotes storytelling in the Lao American refugee community. I would say that the many identities that I claim are Lao American refugee as well as Asian American artist. I am also on the Mayor's Commission of Asian American Affairs, as well as a council member of the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts.
Thank you, Katsi. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Sarah Young. I am the founder and principal of Sojourner Consulting. I'm also a consultant, a volunteer, and a former staff member of the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, which is a community-based organization in Philly Chinatown. I'm a second generation Chinese American. My parents are from Hong Kong, and I grew up in central New Jersey, where there is a concentration of Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, as well as Indian Americans in the metropolitan area of New York.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I already introduced myself earlier, but in case you're just joining us, I'm Rob Buscher, and I'm from the Japanese American community. I serve as the president of the Japanese American Citizens League Philadelphia chapter. A little bit more information. I grew up in rural suburban Connecticut, about an hour north of New York City, and have been in the Philadelphia region for a decade now. So one of the things that I wanted to do in this conversation tonight was really delve into some of the areas in the series that I think might have been glossed over or maybe cut for time reasons. Obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's incredibly difficult to summarize the history of a community as diverse as ours in a single 5-hour series. Obviously, some narratives get prioritized over others. So the selection of the panelists this evening was really in part to try and fill some of those knowledge gaps and also highlight important stories that are happening here in Philadelphia. So to that note, perhaps each of you could talk a little bit about the history of the communities that you belong to here in Philadelphia, giving us a sort of a brief overview. If you can talk to the historical context and then maybe bringing us to today. And Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So expecting that most of our audience today is from the Philadelphia area and has some familiarity with our Chinatown part of the city. You may know that this is the historic Chinatown. It was founded in 1870. Like other Chinatowns on the East Coast, it has its roots in the scattering of Chinese immigrants from the West after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And if you've seen a mural on 10th and Winch Street, just south of Vine Street, there's a wonderful visual rendering of the history of immigration of Chinese Americans to Philadelphia Chinatown, which has the railroad at top turning into a road and highway to represent the path that Chinese Americans took from their respective regions and in China to the Transcontinental Railroad building in the West, to Philadelphia Chinatown and the communal spaces of the neighborhood, and then to the urban renewal period where they protested against the proposed demolition of the area. And so after the initial settlement of Chinatown in the 1870s, the area became really a red light district. Chinese were I'm getting some messages that it's a little hard to hear me. Is this better? Getting closer to my laptop.
Do you have a headset that you could use?
I do.
Oh, that's better.
Maybe, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. I will try not to move my head. Sorry, where was I? Founding of Chinatown. Chinatown is a bachelor society. Back then, Chinatown was located right next to the red light district in the downtown area, which was not considered a desirable place to live back then as it is now. There was a bar on every corner, is a very common reminiscence of folks that lived in the neighborhood back then. And starting in the 1920s and moving towards the mid-20th century, it was seen as a place of light and associated with poverty and dirt. I'm getting a number of messages that are saying my connection's not good. No, okay.
Yeah, the audio is breaking up just a bit. Why don't we actually jump to Faria, and can you maybe try headphones to see if that's better?
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry about that.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. My area of research is on South Asian Americans. And so, before I talk a little bit about the history of South Asians in the US, what I would say is how incredibly important this PBS series is. If we take a look at the curriculum in our elementary schools and in our high schools, there's almost no information about the Asian American experience. And so I'm very grateful to PBS for creating this series, because I think it's an important tool that all educators can use to not only highlight, but to incorporate the Asian American experience as part of the American experience. So when we talk about South Asian Americans, I think there's two things that I really want to stress. First, we really have to emphasize the diversity of the migration experience for South Asian Americans. Who are South Asian Americans? Largely, they come under an umbrella of 7 countries. That's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. These 3 nations comprise the largest amount of migration to the US. But in addition, we have Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bhutan, and Nepal. So there's great diversity in the South Asian American experience. And then the other thing that I would really emphasize for all of us is to understand that migration is actually a 2-way relationship. Often we understand it as one individual that arrives on the US soil, but it's actually much more complicated than that. And it is really much more of a relationship between the sending country and the host country. So as the series highlights, South Asians arrived in the US in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, and really to fulfill a need that the US had for cheap labor. So they came to the West Coast to work in lumber yards, on railways, and on farms. On the East Coast, it was a slightly different story, because we see peddlers from from East Bengal, which is now Bangladesh. And we also see around the time of World War I, young seamen coming into the US, settling here along the East Coast. The Bengali peddlers arrived in major cities, ports in New York, and then really spread out throughout the US. Again, fulfilling particular needs that the US had. If we think about South Asian migration, there's certainly many important moments, and I would actually just highlight 3. 1923, when a young Bhagat Singh Thind applied for US citizenship, was denied, even though he argued he was Caucasian. Bhagat Singh Thind was denied based on the fact that he was actually brown. He could not apply for citizenship. 1946, finally, a very small amount of individuals could come from South Asia, primarily at that time, pre-partition, it was India, and a very small number of those living already in the US could receive naturalization. It was really not until 1965 where we have this Immigration Act that really changes the face of the US. The PBS series does a wonderful job explaining this, and I would highlight it again. In 65, we're in the middle of the civil rights moment. Medicare, Medicaid is passed. We're in the middle of a Cold War, and the US again has a particular need for skilled technical work. As we then see the results, we have a very large number of individuals that come to work in the sciences. If we specifically look at Philadelphia, we see a need in healthcare. And we have a growing community of Christian Malayali nurses that arrive. If we think about Limerick, we have engineers and scientists that arrive to work at the nuclear power plant. Penn Dental had an international program, and we see an influx of dentists in our area. There were many scholars that came through Temple University and the University of Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania Houston Hall hosted many Eid prayers for young Muslims students at the time. So the diversity is certainly present. As migration changes and more individuals are allowed to come to the US, we see that not only skilled professionals are coming, but others are coming through family reunification, through H-1B visas, through the diversity lottery. The diversity lottery is actually the one way, one of the most important ways that we have a thriving Bangladeshi community in West Philadelphia and also in Upper Darby. So again, what I would emphasize is when we think about South Asian Americans, diversity is incredibly important, as is this relationship with how migration changes.
Thank you, Faria. Really appreciate that overview of the South Asian American community here in Philadelphia and some of the broader context. Katsi, would you like to talk a little bit about the Southeast Asian community and the Lao American community?
Sure. I'm just going to say before I get started that, like Faria said, in our regular school system, the Asian American history isn't as incorporated into our education as it should be. And so for me, my understanding of Lao American history, or Southeast Asian American history, is based on me talking to my parents, me talking to older Southeast Asians, me talking to other Lao Americans that I've met in my journey, and sort of them sharing their experience. And so I'm just going to go off of that. Okay, so I'm going to start with Laos. Laos is a Southeast Asian country. It's landlocked and it's nestled between Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. I would say that our, I guess, major influx of becoming American immigrants happened during the Vietnam War. And part of this is because at around the same time, Cambodia and Vietnam were also having their own civil wars, as was Laos. And when you know, the Vietnam War happened, you know, when America decided to get involved, part of what happened with that was the secret war in Laos, which is a secret bombing campaign in Laos. And part of the reason that happened was that America's justification was that in order to make sure that Northern Vietnamese troops wouldn't try to sneak into South Vietnam through Laos, that they would bomb Laos. And so, of course, you know, if I wanted to parallel Philadelphia history, I often think of the MOVE bombing in West Philadelphia. And so it's not unlikely of America to destroy everything in order to get to your enemy. And so what's unfortunate about the bombings in Laos is that it was just how much it was, right? And so like the numbers come out to be a plane load of bombs dropped every 8 minutes for 24 hours for 9 years. And so it's crazy to think that bombs of this number could be dropped on a country that you're not even at war with, you know? But also because these bombs didn't detonate once they landed, they essentially became landmines. So they dropped into Laos, but they didn't explode immediately. And so, of course, the destructive aftermath of this is also that kids who were born way after the war was even over, are now victims of these bombs because they're still active in the ground, and because of the way that they're shaped. So they're like these little bomblets, and they look like little balls. And so a lot of times little kids see them, they think they're balls, and they go to play with them. But at the same time, Laos is also a relatively poor country, and so even if people are aware that these are bombs and they could go off, it is still metal, and metal is still valuable. And so people who think that they're going to collect bombs that have already gone off don't realize that there are more bombs around them. And so there's been a lot of efforts to remove the bombs. As far as our journey to the United States, I would say that we came in with the, I think they called it the Indonesian refugee crisis, which I don't know the year, but it's like late 70s, 80s. And so, you know, as part of the US's taking in of refugees, we came in under that. And so I think in thinking about these kinds of things that are happening in the way that they're labeled, many people don't realize, you know, one, like Laos, what does Laos have to do with the US, you know? But also because it's called the Vietnam War, so most people think that the only people who are affected are the people in America, the soldiers in America who went to Vietnam, and the people who live in Vietnam, without realizing that, you know, Laos and Cambodia are also affected. And so in Philadelphia, I know that a lot of the refugees were resettled in South Philly, around like the Snyder, 7th and Snyder area, which is where my parents were and they grew up, but also in like the Olney area. And a lot of people don't know this, but in West Philly. And I remember as a little kid that my dad used to go to a pool hall on 45th Street, right on 45th and Sampson, and that, like, you know, some of the people still live there, and that there was like a little grocery store on like 44th and Spruce. And so many of those immigrants moved out and they've, you know, moved away. But I think when I was growing up, it was very common, you know, to go to a store somewhere and they were loud and they had all your ingredients. So I think that for the most part, when many of the Lao immigrants that arrived here, they, you know, they made a community for themselves. That's where I am now.
Thank you for that overview, Katzy. All right, Sarah, let's see if your audio is better now.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay, great. I just went around frantically disconnecting all my devices from my Wi-Fi. So I think I talked a little bit about the settling of our Philly Chinatown after the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and in the wake of very strong anti-Chinese sentiment, and was just getting to Chinatown as a bachelor society and approaching the urban renewal era of the mid 20th century. So for the story of Philly Chinatown, which many in Philadelphia know, the urban renewal era was really a turning point for this community, at which city planners had started to plan for the demise of Chinatown due to its location downtown, which was then considered as redeveloping and a desirable location. Its location in the heart of many planned arterials for transportation, so adjacent to the Ben Franklin Bridge, of which Race Street back then was the main artery, as well as in the core of the areas between the Independence Mall to the east, the Gallery to the south, which was slated for redevelopment, the Vine Street Expressway, the crosstown expressway planned to the north, and then later in the 80s and 90s, the PA Convention Center to the west. And so all of these planned developments saw Chinatown as an area of blight rather than a value. And as a working class community, really associated with dirtiness, with squalor, with vice, and on the flip side of that, as a source of fascination for tourists who came into the neighborhood and wanted to experience Chinatown and see the Chinese in their native environment. And so at the time, in the 1960s, there was a second generation of immigrants in the community that really rose up to organize the neighborhood for the first time and to specifically protect the Holy Redeemer Church and School, which is at the corner of 10th and Vine Street today. And that would have been slated for demolition under the proposal for the Crosstown Expressway. These were teenagers, they were youth who organized and protested against this last major project that would destroy a beloved community gathering place, a place where not only religious services were held, but where it was really a reflection of the social networks and the community networks and services in the neighborhood. And so the Save Chinatown movement was really born as the Save Our Church movement. And that history generated the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, which is the organization that I am a volunteer for today, which was founded in 1966. And out of decades of activism and negotiation with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, as well as the Philadelphia City Planning Commission, they were able to preserve the heart of the neighborhood and preserve the church. And you see the scaled down expressway today with the sub Vine Street Expressway rolling underneath and through the city, and then Vine Street Local in the heart of the neighborhood, separating the north and south part of Chinatown. But Chinatown today really reflects many of the same characteristics and challenges that Chinatown of the past as well had, and part of that is lack of access to general services in the city, the general impact of the built environment on that community, which still stands today, lack of community amenities like parks, community centers, and other places that you might see in a traditional neighborhood, which are still challenges that are reflected in the neighborhood today. One thing I would also note around the history of Chinatown is that although the Chinese community in Philadelphia has greatly diversified, increased in number, and Chinatown is no longer the core community where Chinese are concentrated, and there are growing concentrations in South Philadelphia as well as the Northeast. The historic characteristics and challenges of the community are still very much reflected in the dynamics that this neighborhood struggles with, including ambivalence towards Chinese as either a source of fascination, as an exotic people or a group to paternalize and use, or as a source of vice and evil and as a threat. And oftentimes, as I think Faria and Katsi noted as well, this perception is something that swings with our foreign policy in America. And so Chinatown is a microcosm of all of those dynamics, often reflecting the national mood towards Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans, and in Philadelphia specifically reflecting the way we we treat Chinese and other Asian American communities in the greater city, where there's often a very dominant narrative that is between the Black and white communities in the city, but do not reflect greater understanding or meaningful engagement of the Asian American communities here.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And, you know, kind of thinking a little bit more about some of those demographics that you're talking about, I absolutely agree with you that it is this kind of optic of white and Black when it comes to racial discourse in Philadelphia. But Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders make up about 7% of the total Asian American population in Philadelphia. According to the 2010 census, it was just over 100,000 persons of Asian descent living here. So it's a pretty substantial community, although obviously we are split between many smaller subgroups within our ethnic communities. I wanted to offer just a brief summary of the Japanese American community history as well for some context. Japanese Americans began immigrating into the United States shortly after the country was opened to the West. Commodore Perry from the US Navy forcibly opened Japan to do trading with the United States. And by the 1870s, there were Japanese from the higher class samurai families that were actually sending their children to American universities for education in fields that were not yet very prevalent in their own country. University of Pennsylvania was, of course, one of the country's top universities, and Japanese diplomats as well as noblemen were sending their children there to become educated as doctors, dentists, and lawyers, as well as engineers and architects. So some of the first Japanese who settled here were from these upper classes, and their experiences were markedly different from the middle to lower class Japanese Americans who were settling on the West Coast, largely in agriculture. It was always very small numbers. So although the Chinese American and Japanese American communities start around the same time in Philadelphia, Japanese never numbered more than a few dozen. And in fact, prior to 1941, with the start of World War II, there were less than 50 Japanese Americans that were on the census in 1940. So it's a really very small community by comparison to certainly the Chinese American community, even at that time. But what changed was, of course, the wartime incarceration. And when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, forcing the removal and the mass incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast into inland prison camps, many Japanese Americans who were able to fled into the interior of the country. Those who were unable to did go to the camps. And actually, Philadelphia was the first big city on the East Coast to begin welcoming Japanese Americans to resettle after the incarceration. So that started as early as the fall of 1942, when some of the Quaker institutions like Bryn Mawr and Swarthmore College extended invitations to the Japanese American college-age students whose studies were cut short by the start of the war to come and finish their degrees here in Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs. So in the span of about 4 years, Japanese American community grows from about 50 people to over 7,000 at its peak. And people from all different types of industry, ranging from newspaper individuals to folks working in agriculture, as well as other specialized industries like medicine and chemistry, began settling here in Philadelphia and largely were welcomed with open arms. And I think that's largely to the credit of the Quakers and the tremendous amount of advocacy that they did here to prepare the local community and really make this distinction that these were American citizens, or at least were people who had been residing in the United States for many decades and posed no threat in terms of military necessity. But ultimately, when the war ends, people did begin dispersing back to the West Coast. We see the numbers shrink from about 7,000 to 3,000, and it's actually continued to dwindle today on the 2010 census, Japanese Americans only numbered about 2,000 out of that 100,000 or so Asian Americans in Philadelphia. So it's an interesting narrative. And again, you know, even though this community has been here, in my family's case, for 4 generations in the United States, there's so few of us here in Philadelphia that it's hard to perhaps get noticed within the larger scope of Asian American community. So moving on from some of the community past, let's talk about the present. And I'd really like to delve into some of the issues that are facing our respective communities today. Here in Philadelphia specifically, I'm wondering if Katzy, you'd like to start us off.
Sure. So my answer is very complicated, but I will do my best to not take so long. If you had asked me this question in January, I think that the issue that was facing our community, first and foremost, probably would have been how to deal with the deportation of Lao Americans as part of this like larger deportation of Southeast Asian Americans that we've been seeing happen with the Cambodian community, the Vietnamese community. If you had asked this question in April, I would have said that the biggest issue would have been how to celebrate Lao New Year, but also to protect yourself because of the rise of anti-Asian violence because of COVID-19, but also trying to explain to our elders not to go outside and like how to, you know, get materials to them and tell them to stay safe and keep a distance and like, you know, help in terms of getting food or, you know, getting cleaning supplies or those sorts of things and what to do. If you had asked me in May, I think my answer would have been how the younger generation is trying to have conversations with the older generations about Black Lives Matter and sort of the words that we don't know in terms of trying to explain justice and injustice. And, you know, we may know the words for police and we may know the words for, you know, a Black person, but we don't know the words for abuse of power and that sort of thing. But we're here in August. And so I think my answer for today is going to be census. And like you mentioned before, you know, the numbers are getting smaller and you wonder if it's really because, you know, people are, I don't know, passing away and then they're not being counted, or that, you know, if people aren't sure what to put down, if they're mixed heritage. For the Lao community, census is a little bit hard to explain because on the one hand, it is the government coming to ask for your information, but then on the other hand, you know, it's not the kind of thing where if you get involved that like it affects your it affects your benefits or it affects, you know, your citizenship status. And so it's really hard to explain to our community, you know, why it's important to be counted, and that like you should partake in it. And like, again, there is a language issue with the younger generation and older generation in trying to explain, you know, what it means to be counted and you know, the benefits of that, because I think because it takes, you know, it's every 10 years. So like nobody knows if the reason that like they're building a school or a park or a senior citizen center has to do with census. Like you can't really directly link that, but you just, you know, you just want to tell people that, you know, like the more that your community is able to be counted correctly, the more access to resources we can get, you know. And so again, one of the issues that we face is even the idea of translation materials for census in Lao, which we've had to borrow from our colleagues in other counties or in other states where there is a larger Lao population, and they are able to get materials because they, you know, counted above whatever number was needed to get translation materials provided. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Katzy. And yeah, that's absolutely a lot of different and complex issues, and certainly gives us a lot to delve into, I think, later in the series of conversations. Faria, would you like to share some thoughts from the South Asian American community?
Sure, Rob. You know, I think, like Katzy said, I think many of the issues are represented in the South Asian American community as well. Among them, issues of discrimination and Islamophobia. And, you know, I don't think that one has to be from the South Asian community and be Muslim to have to feel the impact of the bias, right, around Islamophobia. And so we have definitely in the past few years seen a rapid increase in the numbers regarding school bullying. That's a major issue for our children. The lack of education around our cultures and our different faiths. The other thing that I would say is language access. You know, we really need assistance with making sure that our services have the correct and appropriate language access, so that all Asian Americans can receive the rights that they are, you know, entitled to. I would also say that healthcare is a real issue. We have a growing population of elders in our community, and, you know, without proper language skills and without, you know, proper access to healthcare, these issues are really actually on the rise. I think, as Katzy mentioned, that the census is going to be really important. We just don't have accurate numbers from our community. I mean, yes, it's really important, but I think that we also have to remember that there are language issues, but there's also issues around distrust of the government, right? And we also need to understand contextually where our families are coming from and the relationships that they may have had with their previous nation governments. And so this makes all of this very complicated, but I would urge us all to make sure that we fill out the census so that we do get accurate reporting. I think it's incredibly important for us to be able to access the services that our communities need.
Thank you, Faria. And it's a great reminder to fill out the census because it is so crucial in terms of guaranteeing government assistance. Although, as you mentioned, challenging when our immigrant brothers and sisters are coming, in some cases, from countries where they might be afraid to give information to the government. Sarah, would you like to talk a little bit more? I think you started to touch upon some of the anti-Asian bias issues that we've seen, but perhaps you'd like to talk about that and any other challenges that you're seeing right now.
Sure. So I think Chinatown, and not only in Philadelphia, but across the country, was one of the first communities to see the effects of COVID starting in January of this year. And so small businesses saw a sudden drop in customers who were Asian in background, as well as the usual tourists from outside of Chinatown. And there began to be a rise in anti-Asian sentiment and incidents of bias and hate crimes in the Philadelphia community against all folks that looked like they might be Asian and not just Chinese. But all of the issues around cultural marginalization as well as lack of language access begins to compound these issues and the challenges of I'm getting a message to turn my video off.
Yeah, your audio is a little garbled. Try see if that helps a little.
Is that better?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All of these challenges really compound the issue for Asian Americans and for Chinatown as a very prominent representation of this community. And I'll also say that in addition to COVID emptying out the small businesses, which are the main source of jobs for community members in this neighborhood, they were also facing issues of gentrification and displacement for years before the COVID crisis. And so, I think it's often tough for folks to hold both concepts in their mind, that this community can be threatened by growth that's not inclusive of those members, as well as by the threat to the viability of small businesses. But it's very much both and challenge for Chinatown and for other Chinese Americans across the city. And so, as the community continues to organize itself for its long-term preservation, one of the challenges that's inherent in that history is handing over the baton to the next generation of activists in Chinatown to be continuing to frame that struggle in the lens of justice and of equity and of survival, but to be doing that through the voice of a new generation and to be really raising those issues in a way that speaks to the diversity of the community as it is now, which is much more sprawling and fractured than it has ever been.
Thank you for that, Sarah. All right, so at this point, we're gonna jump to a couple of audience questions, and a reminder to everyone who's following along with us, you can type in your questions either into the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll try to get to them if we have time. Fern Lee Hagedorn asks, are any of you in Philadelphia working with the school district regarding teaching Asian American history in the public schools?
I am not. I'll just answer this very quickly. I have very limited information on this, but what I would add is that the Governor's Commission worked very closely with the Pennsylvania Department of Education. We did create a speaker list and a reading list that's age appropriate and at grade level. That is supposed to be on the Pennsylvania State Educators website, the SAS portal, I believe. So, Fern, I would recommend looking into that reading list exists, and I hope that it can be helpful for you.
Thanks for that, Faria.
I'm not involved in any teaching Asian American study teachings, but I will say that as a parent, that my daughter's school is, she goes to Thomas Charter Elementary, and her school is very active in Asian American studies and, learning everyone's New Year. Like, I know, like a couple years ago, I went to teach the kids how to give each other blessings. And so I don't know about every school. I would say that if you are a parent, to be in touch with your teacher, your kids' teachers, and if there's like any chance to share anything, I think that it's worth the while.
Thanks, Katsi.
And I'll also add that the Folk Arts Cultural Treasures Charter School in Chinatown, also known as FACS Charter School in Chinatown, has developed a multicultural curriculum which includes Asian American history and community history for teaching within FACS.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Carol, who asks, I would be interested in learning more about any recent immigration in the Asian American community. What are the reasons why Asian Americans are coming to Philadelphia in the last 20 years or so?
I can just add a piece about South Asian Americans. You know, for South Asian Americans coming to the U.S. Now versus in the late 1800s, I think the reasons for migration are somewhat similar, right? They're like many others, a desire for a better life, a desire for advanced education, a desire for their children to grow up safely and to have multiple opportunities. The past 20 years for South Asian Americans, I would say the major points of migration, one has been the diversity lottery. That has now actually ended for South Asian Americans. But that is the driver for a lot of our Bangladeshi American community members. And I would say H-1B visa, as the US specific industries have specific needs for technical work. We see an influx of H-1B visa workers, which are temporary workers. And largely, I would say probably about 80% of H-1B visa goes to folks in India. And so we see a growing community there as well.
Thanks, Faria. Yeah, in the interest of time, let's move on to the next question. We have a couple of people asking similar questions. Essentially, as community members, what do you think makes the Philadelphia experience different or unique from living in other cities?
That's a great question.
Go ahead.
And as somebody that now considers Philly home after living here for almost 15 years, I know Philly to be almost has a village kind of environment where it's a small town feel in a big city. And I think that very much connects to my experience of the Chinatown community as well, where it feels like you're living your daily life on a very small and kind of tight-knit stage, but at the same time dealing with the dynamics of a large metropolitan area and the inherent challenges of having your community seen and understood within that stage.
I was gonna say that I know that in comparison, especially to the West Coast, like being Lao, like I know that I'm always just expected to explain where Laos is and where I'm from and how we got here. But I would say that like in terms of living amongst my other Asian American community members, I definitely feel seen and heard and a part of that community, and that even though the Lao stores that I grew up with are no longer open, I know that I can go to the Vietnamese supermarkets and feel like I could find the ingredients that I'm looking for, or go to 7th Street to the Cambodian shops and find the things that I'm looking for. And I also feel like in terms of community organizations that they will definitely look out. They, it's not just a matter of I'm going to get this grant for myself and I'm just going to serve this community. I often get, emails from my colleagues and say, do you want to be part of this? There's something that I think that the Lao community could really benefit. Do you want to be a part of this? And I really appreciate that, when there is a need, that I can turn to my other Asian American community members and feel that we can get school supplies or resources for our elders. So
thanks, Katsi. Yeah, I guess echoing that whole West Coast, East Coast thing, from the Japanese American perspective, I mean, there are about 150,000 Japanese Americans in Los Angeles alone. I mean, that's more than the entire Asian American population of Philadelphia. And I'm literally one of like 2,000 here in the city of Philadelphia. So, in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like being alone on an island, but compared to where I grew up in rural suburban Connecticut, where the only other Japanese Americans were my mom and sister, I mean, it's an incredibly large community for me. But you go to the West Coast, and it's not just LA. It's San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle to an extent. We have Nihon Machi, Japan towns, right? I mean, it's like a Chinatown, only it's with Japanese people, and there are new immigrants from Japan, and they speak in Japanese, and it's amazing. And there's just so many things that people in these communities have access to that we don't on the East Coast, and really anywhere else outside of the West Coast as a Japanese American. So if anything, I think it's a feeling of loneliness or isolation as a Japanese American. Faria, did you want to contribute to that question as well?
Sure. I would say Philadelphia is incredibly unique. I mean, in 1886, this first South Asian American woman received her medical degree from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, right? That's incredible. That was 1886. And so, certainly Philadelphia has changed quite a bit. And I think really mostly since the 1980s, when we welcomed refugees with open arms, and they really actually, immigrants and refugees actually changed the face of Philadelphia, right? When Philadelphia was going through a really difficult moment of many people leaving the city, it was really immigrants and refugees, Asian Americans that rebuilt the city and stayed and worked. And so, as a result, I think that we can all share in the incredible diversity and the warmth that the city has in terms of the food culture, in terms of the celebrations. And part of that, I think, Rob mentioned before too, is part of that is the Quaker heritage of the city, of welcoming everyone. We have two wonderful organizations, among many wonderful organizations, but that's HYYY as well as Nationality Services Center, which also helps to not only welcome refugees, but facilitate their lives here. So these are really important pieces of history about the Philadelphia area that many don't know. For me, I would say I agree with Katzy and with Rob that the Asian American community is really amazing and welcoming. It's a gift to have the colleagues that I have, on this panel, for example, to be able to share with them particular crises or moments of distress as well as joy. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Faria. Well, I hate to cut this short, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Since we just have a few minutes left, I'm hoping that each of our panelists can just give us a very brief closing statement, either about something that you hope for the future for your community or something that you took away from our discussion today. Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and I'm so grateful that there's the interest and the expertise here to be representing these conversations for part of our communities, acknowledging that there are many Asian communities that are not represented on the panel today. But I think thinking about the future of the Chinatown community specifically, I think oftentimes there's this spotlight on the neighborhood as well as a way that we take for granted the existence and availability of that safe haven, of that physical space that will be there for us and always continue to survive. My hope is that we realize how hard that work is and that we all join in making that possible. And especially as a second generation immigrant from Hong Kong, where you're seeing that city over the past year burn up, and then to see it politically destroyed and its freedom scattered, you can't help but to look at Chinatown and other places that have been built as havens across the city for Asian Americans and think about what it will take to make sure that that does not happen here.
Thanks, Sarah. Kathy?
I was going to say that, so we recently there was an exhibition at the Asian Arts Initiative called Thank You, No Thank You, which was inspired by the Southeast Asian refugee perspective of the Vietnam War. And so the conversations that I've had with those artists were very enlightening and fun, and like I really enjoyed them. And so even though the exhibition is no longer up, it closed 2 weeks ago, I would say that, you know, during this time, especially, to please continue supporting artists, to please, you know, just like you are now in this conversation about Asian Americans, to, you know, center it and make sure that, you know, people who have felt underrepresented or like overlooked, to support them and give them opportunities to speak. And I think the last thing to say is thank you to you, Rob, and WHYY for including me and like for being able to have this talk and to have programs like Asian Americans on TV so other people can, you know, be able to learn about it in the ways that they can.
Thanks, Kathy. Maria?
Yeah, just to close, I would also want to express my gratitude to WHYY, everyone that worked to put this together, to you, Rob, for hosting this. It's been an amazing panel. I also would urge everyone, particularly young Asian Americans, to learn your history, right? I am a teacher, so I have to say, you know, something about the education piece, but I think it's critical that we understand where we came from and who we are. It's only then that we can really understand where we want to go. So for those that are not Asian American, I would urge you to re-examine this particular legacy and to re-examine it as Asian Americans are very much a part of the fabric of the US. Thanks.
Thank you, Faria. I just have a few short announcements before we close tonight's program. WHYY will be repeating episode 2 of the Asian Americans, titled A Question of Loyalty, on Thursday, September 24th at 8 p.m. The episode tells the story of Japanese American wartime incarceration through the stories of 2 families. Following this episode at 9 p.m., they will be presenting in partnership with People's Light and Theater the recorded stage performance of Hold These Truths, Jeannie Sakata's critically acclaimed solo play about Japanese American activist Gordon Hirabayashi, who challenged the government's removal orders during World War II. As I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's session, this conversation has been the first in a series that will take place over winter and spring 2021, when WHYY will be rebroadcasting all 5 episodes of Asian Americans. If you would like to share any thoughts, feedback, or recommendations as we go into production on that series, or would like to share your own stories, please email programming@whyy.org. And just to note, I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions today. There were a lot of great ones we didn't have time to get to, but we have recorded them and we're going to do our best to incorporate that into future sessions. There is also a survey link for feedback about today's session that will be shared in the chat. Thank you again to all of our panelists and all of our attendees, and have a good evening.